This is a Media Lab podcast. Welcome to Putting It Together, the podcast that goes through the entire body of work of Stephen Sondheim, show by show and song by song. My name is Kyle Marshall, your self-described Sondheim expert. And today is going to be a bit of an interesting anomaly in this show's history. I think that it's appropriate to really get a good understanding of what the inspiration to A Little Night Music is before we start to jump into the individual songs of that show. And therefore, what I need to do is jump back a lot of time into the past, to 1955 in particular, to talk about Smiles of a Summer Night.
Ulla Jakobsson, Eva Dahlbeck, Harriet Andersson, Margit Karlqvist, Naima Wistrand och herrarna Gunnar Björnstrand, Jan Kuller, Åke Fridell, Björn Bjelvenstam. Sommarnatten lär ha flera leenden, bara vi här har ett, då alla unga öppnar sina hjärtan. Och här har vi kanske ett annat leende, vad vet vi? Jo, en sak. Det fanns ingen som kunde kyssas med en sån våldsam extas som advokat Egerman. Han älskade den.
And so to help me out, I thought there would be no better person, at least it had nothing to do here on a Sunday, is my co-host of Kyle and Dave versus the Machine, David Youn. Thank you for joining me here, David.
It was a pleasure until you introduced me that way. So
You're welcome.
I guess I'm still glad to be here.
You know, what I usually ask people the very first time they appear on this show is, what is your history with Stephen Sondheim? And I'm still going to ask that to you, even knowing that we're not talking about a Stephen Sondheim show. Not yet here, at least. So do you have any background with Stephen Sondheim?
No, I mean, hanging out with you, I'm through osmosis. Apparently, he's the most important person who ever lived. But
I will not stop whistling Send in the Clowns. It's just
I was going to say, and it turns out that I've probably inadvertently been a part of the Sondheim universe, but I don't have any intentional relationship with said human being. But you can educate me, because I'm sure.
Well, I thought you were telling me that you had all this musical theater knowledge, though.
Not knowledge. I like musical theater. At least as far as the popular boom post Andrew Lloyd Webber and Les Mis and all that stuff came out in the 80s and 90s, and I had sheet music. I sang stuff. I used to know the words by heart. I like going to shows. I'm not a fan the way, for example, we love movies.
Right.
I don't catalog who writes them. I don't know who the stars are. I just enjoy a good piece of performance.
You're part of the unwashed masses, is what you're trying to say.
Sure. I don't even know what that means. Yeah, that's.
But I'm going to take it as a compliment.
All right.
By the end of this season, hopefully you'll be up to speed a little bit, because to pull back the curtain a little bit, I am going to invite you to come back to talk about the movie version of A Little Night Music, which, somewhat spoiler for my opinions, isn't the greatest example of the show, but it does exist.
Perfect.
Not to blow past it too much, what is Kyle and Dave versus the Machine all about?
Well, we are podcast partners in a movie review podcast that was created because you made a machine that is going to end the world unless we comply with its wishes to watch films each week. And this past year, we've been stuck in 1999, which actually was a good choice by the machine, because, that's a good year for movies.
No, for sure.
As we're finding out, pretty bad year for some as well.
There has been some rough moments in our podcast history so far, for sure. But there has been some good enough bright spots, I would say. Dave, why don't you sit right there for a moment? I think what's going to happen now is that I'm going to go thank some sponsors. And then when we return, we'll delve a little bit further into Smiles of a Summer Night. Hi, everyone. I am so excited to be back here talking about A Little Night Music. Just starting this new season, I have some fun things planned over the next, I think, 13, 14 weeks. I forget exactly now how many episodes I have now planned for this season, but I think there's going to be some great conversations, and there's going to be some twists and turns along the way as we discuss this musical where you'd think it'd be just about a bunch of stuffy people trying to get their rocks off, but it is anything but. We'll have a more involved conversation next week, but I am here to tell you a few things, such as Putting It Together is a proud member of the Alberta Podcast Network, locally grown, community supported. The Alberta Podcast Network promotes and supports Alberta-made podcasts and connects their audiences with Alberta-based businesses and organizations. This episode of Putting It Together is brought to you by the Calgary Foundation. Whether it's funding anti-racism programs, addiction recovery, or food hampers for the hungry, for 65 years, the Calgary Foundation has proudly supported the charitable community to address some of Calgary's biggest challenges. Now, during this period of unprecedented urgent needs, Calgary Foundation renewed its commitment to building a healthy, vibrant, giving, caring, and resilient community. If you're a registered charity looking for a grant, a professional advisor creating a giving plan for your client, or a donor wanting to give back to community, discover a wealth of resources at calgaryfoundation.org and learn more about their work through Calgary Foundation's Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram. This week we're also brought to you by ATB. So even now, good advice is within reach. Your financial situation today, tomorrow, or this very hour is why ATB is here. ATB will listen and help with the knowledge and solutions you need right now. Why? Because ATB was built to help Albertans. For more information, you can visit atb.com. While I'm here, I should also tell you about all the different ways that you can help to support the show. So if you would like to support the show monetarily, which will only help to grow and make the show better, you can do so over at our Patreon page. I actually think I need to thank Gail, who started supporting during the small break that we were on. I don't believe I've actually thanked her on the show yet, but things have been hectic, as you might suspect. I also need to give a huge thanks to the God That's Good tier from Patreon, the Holy Triumvirate, Jack, Todd, and Barry. I truly do appreciate your support. Also, if you want to help support the show for absolutely free, you can go and leave a review anywhere that you listen to these podcasts. Apple would be perfect, but if you listen on another platform that allows for ratings and reviews to happen, do it there too. It's just a great way to promote into all of those weird algorithms, which I don't quite understand. But if it's good enough to bring about the downfall of democracy, then I think it's something that we can help to grow this little podcast. Anyways, let's get back to the show.
Sitting next to me is certainly one of the most admired, and I might even say one of the most worshipped men in the movie world, or in the entire entertainment theatrical industry. Ingmar Bergman has directed an astonishing number of film masterpieces, and Wild Strawberries and Smiles of a Summer Night, and The Seventh Veil, The Seventh Seal, of course, The Magician, The Virgin Spring. They go on, the list, Through a Glass Darkly, and The Passion of Anna, and I've left out a great number of them. He has agreed to talk with us tonight, and I guess, first of all, I must compliment you on being exactly...
How about your history with Swedish people, Dave?
You know, I like the Swedes. They're tall, they're blonde.
love their fish.
Oh God, you know what's interesting about Sweden is I was actually just telling Helen, for some reason.
Who's Helen, by the way?
My wife. I was just telling my wife, Helen, this book comes up a lot, Samilla's Sense of Snow, Peter Hoeg, which I don't know why, but I watched that movie. I read the books. And then, Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. What is that guy? I don't remember.
Stieg
Larsson. That's a weird, fucked up story. Not just the novel, but his life and
is
how.
Is he Swedish too?
I'm pretty sure that's a Swedish. Now I'm doubting myself. But that story of that getting published posthumously and the protracted drama around the family, that's pretty fucked up too. The Maple Leafs had a Swedish captain, right? Matt Sundin. I'm from
course
Toronto.
We had to bring this back to hockey because we live in Canada. Yeah.
Well, I'll just bring that up because that was probably the last Maple Leaf that I actually liked.
Boy, it's a good thing no one who likes sports listens to this show, or else we would be in so much trouble.
Yeah, the Nordic people. Oh, I have a friend who moved there. He's Chinese, but from Toronto, married a woman. I can't remember how they met. They have a family in Sweden now. So I have an open invitation to visit Sweden, which I will not take because it's probably colder than here. And the coronavirus is going to prevent me from enjoying that trip.
Yeah, it's probably a good idea for right now. How about Mr. Ingmar Bergman? I feel bad for being a movie fan, and until we watched this movie, I had not seen a single Ingmar Bergman film.
Me neither. And I think the problem was that his huge collection is protected by either Criterion or by some other paywall, which I have not been able to invest in. Other than purchasing a film, like, for example, Seventh Seal, I'd have to pay money to own it. I don't know if I'd ever want to rewatch something like that again, because it looks like a movie that you ought to only watch once. Not that I've seen it. It doesn't look like a very lighthearted person.
Well, that's the thing. I think, honestly, I've been thinking about this. And I think what has prevented me from jumping into Bergman specifically is that there is this aura around him where his films are like dark, depressing, no joy,
ethereal,
like that. Yeah, those types of things. It's like I'm never really in the mood just to jump into like, for sure I'm going to have a bad time with
it's
this.
Tuesday. It's Bergman night. No, that's not. Yeah.
Let me go have my existential crisis of the week.
I mean, we already do that.
Also, too, in the past year, when like every day I'm having 3, it's just like, I don't need another one.
I was going to say, that's what spurred our movie podcast. That's how we deal with things, is through the form of movies. You obviously have theater as well, but
I just break out into song when I'm having a hard time.
I'm actually surprised you didn't ask for us to do our rendition of Bringing the Clowns to open this episode up, because I think it's pretty apropos, as they say.
Yeah, we're actually workshopping a show called Bring in the Doink, Bring in the Clowns. So it's going to be so good. This movie was released December 26, 1955. To put this into a bit of perspective, Ingmar Bergman had actually made 15 feature-length films before this one came out. He was actually just cranking out films, but this one is largely considered his first classic semi-masterpiece. And he talks about the fact that because this film was released in Cannes, with him, he did not actually submit it. His own government submitted it on his behalf. It won the Cannes Film Festival. And basically that catapulted him to, at least in Sweden, just do whatever he wanted for the rest of his career. So this is the film that kind of like elevated him up to like auteur status here for himself.
That's how they're going to talk about this episode for us, Kyle.
Yes, if you can tell everyone that, hey, I was listening to this podcast and it really just elevated itself to auteur status while I was listening to it. It was quite a thing of beauty.
The government Canada's like, you know what, guys? Just do whatever you want. We got you. Yeah.
Yeah, a podcast won at Cannes this week. It was wild. It is currently rated 7.8 on IMDb.
Wow.
Metacritic has no ratings for it. And on Rotten Tomatoes, from 15 critics, it is rated 100%. And from 6,027 users, it is rated 89%. It is available on DVD or Blu-ray, and you can buy or rent it on iTunes. But really, the major way is you can stream this via the Criterion channel, if you are so inclined. Now, this is what we normally do on our podcast. We go through some of the backstory, ratings, and then we usually go into the budget and the box office, which this has no information on that I could find, so I don't know. But its plot description is, in Sweden, at the turn of the century, members of the upper class and their servants find themselves in a romantic tangle that they try to work out amidst jealousy and heartbreak. I apologize to all of our Swedish listeners because I am about to not pronounce names properly. It stars Gunnar Bjornstrand as Fredrik Egerman, Eva Dahlbeck as Desiree Armfeldt, Ulla Jacobsen as Anne Egerman, Bjorn Brelfenstam as Henrik Egerman, Jarl Kuhl as Count Carl Magnus Malcolm, and Margit Kalkvist as Countess Charlotte Malcolm. What do you have to say about any of those actors there, Dave? I'm sure you have a rich backstory that you have been researching and figured out what they've done.
Oh yeah, we're big into Swedish classical theater production. No, you're
such a Bjornstrand head. You're just always talking about Bjornstrand.
Oh, we call it Bjorning around here. No, now we're right. we're bordering on being offensive. Yeah. No, I don't know anything about Swedish people. IKEA, that's awful. But
oh boy, I have so many Allen keys. So, as we said, this was written and directed by Ingmar Bergman, and kind of where it fits into his oeuvre. But basically, his very next film after this one was The Seventh Seal, which is, I would probably say, his most famous, I'm going to guess. At least the scene with Death playing chess with somebody, which has been parodied in Bill and Ted, but of course in a bunch of other properties since then. Other films that would bring him acclaim that you might be familiar with: Through a Glass Darkly, Persona, Cries and Whispers, Scenes from a Marriage, and Fanny and Alexander. The interesting part about this is that while, yes, this was the inspiration for A Little Night Music, it was also adapted by Woody Allen in A Midsummer Night's Sex Comedy in the 80s. For whatever reason, this movie is something that people just want to adapt in other forms.
Broken people.
Well, let's rip off that Band-Aid there, Dave. And I guess we'll do a non-spoilery section, and then we'll get into like talking with the movie fully. But what is your non-spoilery interpretations of this movie?
I think I should preface this because you gave me so little context on what we were doing. I
intentionally did not give him any context.
I was under the impression, I mean, other than that it would be for this podcast, I was under the impression, even though the timeline didn't match up, that this movie was made from the musical or from a theater piece. And so I think, in hindsight, that I had some structural expectations about what this was supposed to look like.
Right. You wanted singing and dancing, and all you got was like foreboding and pessimism.
Honestly, I mean, I wasn't expecting a musical from Ingmar Bergman. I think if that were the case, it would have, it would have a reputation.
It was basically that and then Paint Your Wagon, two best musicals that were also movies.
I was thinking about, the structure of theater, maybe not in acts necessarily, but just visually about the way people kind of, and, the history of film also comes from that. So it is there, it is present in this, but in the Criterion write-up, it's considered a comedy. And this thing is a little bit funny, but is so dark and so stereotypically European. It's pretty like ominous at moments. So I think I started off lightheartedly being okay with it. In the middle, I dragged, and by the end, the last sort of couple of interchanges, I actually thought was quite redeeming, and it kind of came back together. For me, if we're going to speak specifically, I really didn't like the lead, both the actor
Who
and
do you
the
consider
character.
the lead? I guess.
I don't know what he is, but the lawyer. So
Mr. Egerman, Frederick.
Frederick. So I think that was the hardest part for me to get through, is the way he's portrayed, how he's acted, what he looks like, and what the character's supposed to be doing. In my mind, as a 21st century male in North America, I just couldn't understand how that was working with the story until the very end, where at least the story itself was quite interesting. But there's a line at the end that I really liked. But
okay. It's really actually super fascinating by you saying that is if we talk about the musical, A Little Night Music, I actually have similar thoughts and opinions on the musical, but not about this film. So that's actually very fascinating to me. In that, I'm going to step in this because this is going to maybe be controversial, is that I'm not the biggest fan of the book of A Little Night Music, even though I consider the score that Sondheim wrote to be in his top 5. I think it's beautiful. I think it's great. The music itself is great. But I think the actual book, like the non-musical portions of the show, kind of loses itself in the second act a little bit and then kind of gets redeemed at the very, very end. But I felt this was a pretty straightforward story. Weird and odd for sure. But enough comedy to sustain it through, even though because again, I'm familiar with the musical, knew exactly what was going to happen. What is fascinating, because this is the source material, I know what has been adapted and changed in the musical representation. So there was actually still a few things that surprised me, because they do it this way in the original source material and not in the way that I was expecting it to happen. So I had those kind of weird expectations of knowing where this ends up in an adaptation, but now seen from its original source. In a way, I'm just coming to this realization now, it's like that game Telephone that you play as a kid, where you whisper something into someone's ear around the circle. And then you eventually get to the last person. It's like Purple Monkey Dishwasher. Of course, that's what it is. When it's like, oh, that's actually not what we started off by saying. But then be able to tie it back around and be like, oh, this is how we ended up over here like this. I guess, how about the filmmaking by itself? Like, not talking about the plot or even like the characters, but was there anything that you noticed about the actual, just the filmmaking purely on a technical level?
Sure. I mean, for its era, for what it is, you can see that this director, and again, I don't know in the 50s if it's still separated between the director and the cinematographer. I suspect in Sweden he's doing everything, especially if you're talking about this is pre him being like a global name. but it's beautifully shot. You know, it always stands out to me, particularly with classic black and white films, knowing now as a photographer how difficult it is, for example, to understand how color will react to black and white exposure, that everything is very clean. So it's shot beautifully. The use of light and shadow, it's a little, not heavy-handed, but obvious in that, you know, when the person's having a dark thought, they put them in shadow, and as they reprieve, so they do all this great light work. And some of the scenes and set pieces they build are very interesting. I think contextually, I didn't really understand some of the things like, where they live and what kind of buildings, like the part. Is this a spoiler to talk about where the actress lives? Like there's a couple of parts where. Yeah, you walk in the store, there's a puddle of water, it looks like a stone structure, all of a sudden they're in this like antechamber with adjoining rooms. Like there's a couple of things there where just visually I'm
We're really looking at the upper class here of Sweden for sure.
And then when they go to the palatial estate. So I think it's well shot. And again, kind of like you brought up, by the conclusion, I think it really starts to come together. And I think it's really, really quite a beautiful movie by the end. It's just in the middle as he's trying to show the crisis, maybe intentionally, it gets very tight. The only other thing that I'll say is what throws me off is that dramatic use of a sudden wide angle shot where like there'll be a dark moment, like the Countess, and she's opining about the horrors of marriage, and suddenly she's like forefront with the wide, and it just suddenly becomes almost like a European horror movie or like a suspense drama. Like, what the fuck just happened? Yeah, so there are little moments like that where I started thinking like maybe I should watch Seventh Seal, because that's the kind of thing I would expect from these art house, classical cinema. This I kept thinking was supposed to be a lighthearted musical, so I was wrong in my presumption.
It was not. Yeah. I was, to be brutally honest, I thought that it was going to be very light on the comedy aspect, and I actually chuckled to myself quite a few times. A few snorts through the noses, one might say.
Jesus.
I think you very rarely like laugh out loud, like belly laugh by yourself if you're watching a movie. You usually have to have another person in the room, I find, to like really get into that.
Yep.
By the way, before we go too far, you are completely wrong. There was a cinematographer for this movie. His name is Gunnar Fisher. And he lived all the way up until June 11th, 2011, to the age of 100.
Wow.
So,
is he tied to Ingmar Bergman? Does it say
it looks
there?
like he did Seventh Seal as well, and a bunch of other ones.
It's beautifully, like just from a photographic sense, it's that's
what I was kind of driving at here, is that it's composed so beautifully. And this is, they would probably say this in like a film class, like this is classically shot.
Yep.
And there's just something about that style that I just love. Not that it has to, every movie needs to follow those rules, but every so often when you get so used to some modern filmmaking tricks, just to go back and be like, oh, they're just letting the actors act in this scene. How nice is it to actually see actors act instead of it cutting every like 5 seconds to get into another close-up or something different?
Well, it's, film, when you look at, I'm not a film academic, but when you look at its source, it was always originally shot as though you're an audience member in a theater house. And this thing has that framing where each set piece looks like it could be a stage, which is probably what you're responding to, because it's almost like watching a stage production. Of course, the budget and some of the sort of wider pieces of showing a palace, those are movie capabilities. But once the actors are in front of the camera, it looks like a theater play. The dinner scene, for example, as creepy and weird as that got, that you could see that's on a stage. The way they're sitting, the way they're set up, where the camera moves, I could immediately see that this was a play.
You could see this being performed as a play, I think, in many of the scenes. Well, let's get into, we can be spoilery here now at this point, but getting to some of the plot things that goes on here. Classically, Dave, I find it in our podcast, you often saying, I had no idea what was going on. Did you get into any of those moments here, or were you kind of in on the central plot the entire time? Even though it does get convoluted, I will say. Yeah,
I don't know. It was really hard to get through. Number one, following the if you want to call it the protagonist, the lawyer, Frederick, around, I found him so unappealing that visually and as a character, that every turn that's happening around him in the first, whatever you want to call it, 2 or 3 acts, it was really hard to understand his relationship with everybody. So he's supposed to have this young wife, and I the whole time I was like, A, she doesn't look that young. B, I don't understand why anybody would be with this guy. C, the way he speaks to his so-called son, I don't even understand if they're related. It's so aggressive and brutal and like snide. By the end of the film, I understand what they may have been going for. And this may be a cultural thing. Maybe this is just how,
I think it is, for
Swedish
sure.
people speak to each other, and there's something at the end which I thought the thing was very Shakespearean almost. There's a lot of structure there with, the two clowns. I realized at the end,
I literally wrote that down in my notes here. Yeah, like this is very Shakespeare-like, to the degree that you even have like the two like quote unquote fools at the end, like wrapping up what the theme of the movie is. Like it is very Shakespeare, I think, influenced.
That was the only part at the end with the, I don't know, chambermaid and the butler. But
Petra, and I don't know what his name is, but
it was only when their characters kind of came together and then expounded what the movie's actually about that I was like, oh, okay, I get it. Like this, I get why this movie might be highly regarded. When you look back at it with that viewpoint, then everything suddenly makes sense. And if I ever watch this movie again, which I won't, I think it will be more resonant that the way that this main actor or male actor was supposed to portray this lawyer makes a lot more sense if you understand how they're supposed to be interlinked. But just walking through it, it took me, man, like up to the dinner scene, I was struggling with understanding what all of their relationships were.
Right.
And then the dinner scene got very weird with the shots of the old lady. And it became so, culty, a little Kubrick-esque. Like there was just something creepy. But yeah, it was the clowns at the end. They have that line, which I've been talking to my wife about at the tree. When Petra's asking, like, why can't I find love? And the guy's like, only few people even understand what love is. And everybody else is doomed to try and fail. And she's, she says, they're blessed with the ability, but they also cursed to know what it is to like lose love. And I was like, that's a great line. That's a great premise for a movie to show just the twisted lives of people trying to look the part or actually be in love. And it fixed it for me, but it was difficult to get through.
Well, yeah, what I think I really resonated with, and again, I am influenced by knowing the musical so well. There's certain plot lines that don't really get addressed in the musical that actually get delved into a little bit further here. And the idea that Frederick has this young wife who they have not like consummated their marriage, like she is a virgin, but he is willing to wait for her because he really does love her, but she does not really love him. And that is where like the biggest butting of heads happens with, is that she feels like she thinks she knows what love is supposed to be and how she's supposed to act in a marriage. But really, it's like, you know what? I'm actually in love with your son and have been forever. But it took me a while to figure out that is what I'm doing. I felt sorry for you because you were so sad from losing your wife that I felt compelled to help you out. But my kindness actually was not a kindness. It was actually bad to try and pursue you and be pitying you in that way. And then on the flip side, you have all this like story about infidelity and a man and his wife and his like mistress who all know about each other. And I think there is maybe a little bit of cultural stuff that's being lost, I think, for me, and especially a time period that is now lost for me a little bit. I think what's still resonant about that is this idea that we now call toxic masculinity, but really wasn't probably called that back then, about how men should act, how women should act, and kind of how all those relationships interplay with one another. I don't know. I just found this movie so interesting to watch that all unfold. What I find curious, and I don't have a good answer myself, is like, I don't actually know who I'm supposed to sympathize with the most in the show. Like, am I supposed to be sympathetic to Frederick? Is it Desiree who I'm really supposed to be following? Is it Anne? Is it like, who is it that I'm really supposed to? There's all these characters and they all kind of intertwine. And again, that's a very North American, like, who's my main character? What's the theme of this movie? When maybe Ingmar Bergman just doesn't care about any of that stuff. He just wants to do a light farce. But at the same time, I'm just curious, like, who is my main character really in this movie that I'm supposed to be sympathetic to?
I don't know. I mean, this is also, I think, a very Shakespearean thing. I think even though the male lead, the story trails along him, Desiree is the main character. She's the only one that a person, I think, can feel empathetic for. She's the only one that doesn't, other than being manipulative to get her expression of true love, whatever that is, she actually is the only one that doesn't seem to commit a wrong. And even the idea at the beginning that they pitched that she dumped him, that little scene where she's like, well, I had to dump you because you were never going to marry me. I was just another, sheep for you. And it was only in that moment where I realized he's supposed to be a playboy.
Yeah, he's supposed to be.
Right? And he looks like a zombie. He looks gross. How, we're supposed to visually expect that this guy's having trysts with women until he meets this allegedly 16-year-old girl at the time and becomes enamored with her.
By the way, you know what I find the most hilarious as far as like ages go? He is supposed to be 40 something in this movie, like late 40s, yes, but like 50 is considered like completely ancient, like old person, like take him to a home. And 40 is literally called very old in this movie. Well, so it's like, what a very different time.
Life expectancy used to be a lot different. I think a lot of people, and there's a very important but an interesting dialogue about age of consent and all this stuff. But I think a lot of people lose the fact that before child labor laws, kids were working in factories, and before that on farms, since from the point they can walk. And B, people were getting married at puberty because most people, what's the average life expectancy in like the 15th century? Might be 28 years old, 40 at the max. Like people just died a lot, And
I have to say, I think that it's time to give back to those sorts of times. I think we've been having a free ride much too long in this culture. I
Googled this out of interest. I think the estimated world population at about 100 AD was 300 million people. That's a fascinating thing to think about. There are less people on the entire Earth, than are in the United States of America now. And, whether you're procreating or about letting the world die on its own, it's a completely different context. So even in the 50s, I think, what's the world population in the 50s? Like 5 million, 4 million, 4 billion people? It's about half of what we have now. That's a weird thing to think about too. So it's a different world. Yeah. It's a different world. Never mind it being from Sweden. Oh, I just hit my mic. Never mind it being from Sweden.
That being said, like we've been talking about how it's a comedy. There are some lines that here are the ones that made me laugh the most. Just as a blanket statement, I love the way Desiree says Frederick Egerman's name. Frederick Egerman. Like she just like does this weird like inflection on his name. I love it's like, oh, you suddenly cut feelings above the navel. I thought that was really smart and funny.
Yeah.
Oh, they say like the poor people are having all the fun, but it's how unhealthy it is to listen to what people say. I thought that the old woman saying that was so funny too. There were some really funny moments in this show. So I think that it hits the mark of being a comedy. I think it was Roger Ebert who actually said like for an effective comedy, you just need 3 moments of like huge belly laughs or like something that makes you really expand on laughter, and that's all you really need. Take that for what you will. I don't know if that's necessarily the gold standard, but I think I tend to agree more than I disagree. So in the last half, of course, they all kind of congregate. All these different couples congregate into that one mansion. A few different things. Number one, it does something that I have wanted for my entire life, and mostly it's because of my unhealthy obsession with the board game Clue while growing up. Is I want secret buttons in my house. I want to be able to go and push something for like a secret wall to reveal and something to like come into the room. Like turn over the head of Shakespeare and push a button, and so I can like swing down the staircase. Anyways, I want for the rest of the podcast today, I just want to talk about secret rooms. So how would you decorate your secret room?
I love secret rooms. Panic Room is a great movie. And I haven't been to an escape room thing yet because Helen's terrified of them. But maybe that's what we should do: is go trap ourselves, Kyle, for 4 hours.
Yeah, and try and escape.
A commercial building and click on buttons and try to solve shitty riddles. That'd be awesome.
How do you feel about the ultimate way this movie ends? Like, it ends basically in a Russian roulette situation, so to speak.
I thought it was fascinating. You know, by then I was pretty committed. I think that the first part, I think of what you're driving at, I think the hardest part to watch was the intended suicide to get to that button. I love the button setup.
Yeah.
So you're sitting there wondering who's going to push the button and have access. And as that's building up, I thought they spent so much dark time about this guy's existential collapse. And you're like, is he actually going to kill himself? Like, it was kind of
it is Sweden, so maybe it could.
By the time they got to the end with the roulette scene, kind of to your point, it had become such a comedy, and that whatever general, wherever he is such a clown, like a cartoon character, that I actually, as shocking as it was, I was into it. And I loved, that was the only part towards the end where that actor who was playing Friedrich really, I started really liking him, is his panic. And each of the moment they pull the trigger, I was really invested, whether I thought that was necessary or too violent. And then when you hear the gunshot, I had a pause where I was like, this is the type of movie where that could happen, where he could just be dead. And it was great. And then the army guy comes out maniacally laughing. And I was like, that can go either way too. Like I was on the edge of my seat. Yeah. It is 50s too. I mean, filling it with, what was it? Charcoal or whatever it was. And
maybe buckshot or something. I don't know. What, charcoal maybe.
Yeah. And he's like just covered in soot instead of it having, broken apart half his face anyways. And that's the joke, because he's not dead, but he's permanently disfigured.
Right.
But that's also
and somehow that shows also that he is like really actually in love with his wife. I don't think that relationship is going to end well. I'm just going to point it out that I don't think it's going to end well.
Yeah. Well, and that's such a theater thing too. I by then I was really enjoying it. I think as soon as the two clowns come out and they can underpin the moral themes, I started really buying into what everybody was doing, as crazy as each of them were. The only thing I had trouble with was the young wife's sudden turn to hop on the son. I think it was played really abruptly. It didn't build up well.
I do actually agree with that. I think, again, even in the musical version, this is the one that you have to kind of like suspend your disbelief for the most, which is like, you don't really interact ever much in this entire story, and I'm supposed to believe that you both are in love. I get him. He's been pining away basically from the very beginning, but her also being involved, it's like, it feels like it's a little bit rushed or tacked on.
Yeah. And it's just to make 3 pairs at the end, to tie a neat little bow. Comedically, I thought the matriarch was the best character.
Right. I love Desiree too. I thought she was a phenomenal actress, to be honest with you.
Oh, the woman, Desiree is incredible.
Huge sections of her like just doing monologues and like being funny and like, I don't know, she was done so well. When you were growing up, do you recall there being, because you were in Canada too, just on the opposite side of the country, do you recall there being a Russian roulette scare?
What do you mean,
teenagers playing the game?
Oh,
and so like a few people had been shot?
No, I don't think that happened out east. I mean,
that's what I couldn't remember if this was a Canada thing or like an Alberta thing.
Sounds Albertan, to be honest.
I have a very vivid memory of my parents sitting me down and being like, "What do you know about Russian roulette?" I'm like, "I have no idea what you're talking about. I need way more context for this conversation." And then they explained what the rules were and like why you wouldn't want to do it. And I was like, if someone gave me a gun and told me there was a bullet in it somewhere, I'm like, there is not a chance I would put it against my temple and pull the trigger. But thanks, Mom and Dad, for telling me not to do this.
Learning what I've learned about you and your family, Kyle, I wouldn't be surprised if that was the day after your parents had watched Deer Hunter. Right?
You mean Deliverance, probably.
Well, I feel like...
Deer Hunter. Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, they probably watched that and they're like, oh my God, what if Kyle's in Vietnam with a bandana on and he's stared. And, I don't know. In Toronto, we didn't have, nobody was shooting themselves in the head in a gambling game. It's, especially in the 80s and 90s, it was still a fairly peaceful town. It is not anymore, but it used to be real nice. As Michael Moore once put it, the open doors and waving it, was a great depiction.
Great piece of propaganda. Great piece of propaganda. I actually ended up really loving this movie. I can't actually wait to delve into other Ingmar Bergman films now. I do have the Criterion Channel account, so I can jump in there at any time. So after I'm done the Akira Kurosawa watching that I'm supposed to be doing, I'll follow that up with a chaser of Bergman.
Can I just, I don't know if we should put this on the podcast because it may implicate the scam you've given me, but I really dislike the Criterion app's layout. I can't find anything.
Yes, I agree. The actual interface is
awful.
Complete shit.
Yeah, I don't know
it's very difficult to find something that you want to. You have to do searching. You just have to search for it.
You have to know what you're looking for. So even with the Akira Kurosawa, I was like, where's Kyle finding this? And then one of them was like, by director. And then I had to go into the surplus menu. And then at the bottom was Akira. And I was like, oh, well, great. But fuck.
Just search for the movies, man. And then you'll find it.
Sorry.
I guess as we kick off this season here, then, can you even fathom how this movie gets adapted into a musical for Broadway?
Yeah. I mean, play for sure. I can absolutely see this being a musical. I mean,
where would you put in songs? What characters do you think?
Well, that's the best part of musical theater. I mean, I think the key for my mind for musical theater is having strong enough characters that they can interchange their thoughts in a song format. And this story has way more than enough of that. I mean, it is such a stressful and convoluted relationship with each of the characters, and they can have asides because they all have weird thinking. They all have weird introspection and sort of existential problems. They could easily, again, I didn't even know this was musical, but you could easily have them do an aside. You could easily have them have a little solo to kind of bring the audience's attention to their true desire. So, for example, this part where the young wife falls in love with the son. I mean, that could be a song where you could build up to this idea that she's going to switch allegiances. So I can absolutely see a movie like this or a story like this. I mean, and this is the thing about talking about Shakespearean analogies on the perverted sex stuff, clearly a Woody Allen movie. And then as far as structure and layout, clearly a theatrical base. Adding music's a no-brainer. Whether a person can write well enough for music for it to work, that's up to your man, Steven. But I haven't seen it,
find out.
So I can't tell you. Yeah.
Well, thanks for coming in and talking about this lighthearted Swedish romp.
Can we just quickly let your listeners know about that? I mean, they drink a wine that has semen and breast milk in it. Like what?
Well, I mean, I don't think it actually does. I think she says that originally that's how wine was made. And that would be the moment, if I was at that party, I would be like, spitting that back into the cup.
And they're just, and that moment where they're like staring at it and they're like, no, I'm doing this. I'm drinking
this, man.
I'm drinking this human secretion because I need to understand who I am as a human being. Fuck, man. That was, is that comedic or is that borderline, horror?
It's the 1950s version of There's Something About Mary. So
actually,
if people wanted to stay in contact with you for whatever reason, Dave, how can they do that online?
Oh, I don't know.
Don't you have a Twitter now or something?
Yeah, so I've got a photography podcast that's on Twitter. I don't remember what it's called. Is it MVF Podcast?
I think it is. I'll put the link in the description.
I'm on Instagram, on many different Instagrams, but I guess the main one is DYOUNPHOTO, Dyun Photo. And then Kyle and I have a bunch of social media stuff for our Kyle and Dave versus the Machine, but there's so many different iterations of that. No, there's just one, KDVSTM.
That's right. You can pretty much find everything.
Yeah, that's about it.
Thank you, Dave.
Thanks for letting me be a part of your world.
You're welcome. Wrong composer, but yes. Thank you for listening. You can send emails to puttingittogetherpodcast@gmail.com. You can also follow Sondheim Podcast on Twitter and Instagram. And you can support the show on Patreon by going to patreon.com/puttingittogetherpodcast. Thank you to the Alberta Podcast Network, to the Cowrie Foundation, and to ATB this week. Putting It Together is available on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and pretty much anywhere you can get podcasts from. Consider subscribing so that you never miss an episode. Next week, we are going to be delving into the Overture and the Night Waltz. The sun certainly sits low, doesn't it? As always, a big thank you to the great Chris Taniguchi, who designed the podcast artwork, and to Nick Driscoll for composing our theme music. Well, we've reached the end of our episode. Yes, I know. Goodbye for now.
In my childhood, I very often mixed up dreamings with reality, and I didn't know exactly what happened to me, and time didn't exist.